The Fox and the Grapes. On a warm, sunny afternoon, in the middle of a lush countryside, a clever and hungry fox was making his way through a thick forest. He had been wandering for hours in search of food, but had found nothing to satisfy his hunger. The summer heat was beginning to wear on him, and his stomach growled with impatience. As he trotted through the meadow, the fox noticed something that made his heart leap with joy. Up ahead, nestled among tall, green vines, was a vineyard. The vines were heavy with ripe, luscious grapes, their deep purple color glistening in the sunlight. They were plump, juicy, and looked incredibly sweet, just the sort of treat the fox had been hoping for. His eyes widened as he gazed at the clusters of grapes hanging from a high vine. They looked like the perfect meal, refreshing, sweet, and satisfying. The fox's stomach growled louder as the scent of the ripe fruit reached his nose. His mouth watered just thinking about the taste of those grapes. "I must have them," the fox thought eagerly. "I've searched high and low for something to eat, and now these grapes are just waiting for me." With renewed energy, the fox made his way toward the vines, his paws moving quickly through the grass. He could already taste the sweetness on his tongue. As he reached the base of the vine, he stood on his hind legs and stretched upward, trying to get a good grip on the bunch of grapes. He jumped with all his might. His claws scraped the air, but the grapes remained just out of reach. Undeterred, he took a step back, reared up again, and made another leap. This time, his body was nearly airborne, but still, the grapes seemed to dance teasingly above him. Frustrated, the fox landed on all fours and circled the vine. He pawed at the ground, thinking, "Perhaps I just need a better angle." He tried again, higher with more speed, his body twisting in the air, but to no avail. The grapes remained stubbornly out of reach, taunting him with every failed attempt. "Why won't these grapes just fall into my mouth?" he muttered under his breath. "I can almost taste them." The fox's jumps became more frantic. He leaped and jumped again, but his paws only met empty air. His chest was heaving now, and sweat glistened on his fur as the effort began to take its toll. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, and the weight of his hunger made him feel even more desperate. At last, after yet another leap that missed the grapes, the fox collapsed in a heap on the ground, panting heavily. He lay there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the tempting grapes hanging so high above him. He was exhausted, and the frustration of his failed attempts made his stomach twist with even more hunger. The grapes glimmered in the sunlight, almost mocking him. The fox sat up slowly and, for a long moment, simply stared at them. He began to feel a strange sense of defeat, and the thought of giving up began to settle in his mind. He felt silly for thinking he could ever reach those grapes. After all, they were so high, and no matter how much he tried, they would always remain out of his grasp. The fox paused, then suddenly a thought crossed his mind. He was clever after all. He had outwitted many animals before, and maybe there was a different approach he could take. But as he thought about it, something else entered his mind, a different sort of logic. A thought that made him feel more comfortable, less frustrated, and less hungry. With a sly grin on his face, the fox looked up at the grapes one more time. He stood up, stretched his limbs, and gave his fur a shake. "Who needs these grapes anyway?" he said aloud, trying to convince himself. "They are probably sour and not worth the trouble. I've been chasing them for so long, and now I see it. They're not even worth the effort." He turned his back on the vine, walking away slowly at first, then quicker, as if trying to distance himself from the grapes he had once so desperately wanted. His tail flicked behind him in a final gesture of indifference. The grapes were too high, and anyway, I'm sure they're not as sweet as they look, the fox muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I don't need them. There are plenty of other things in the forest to enjoy. I'll find something better, something easier. I don't have time for things that are too difficult to get. As the fox trotted away, a feeling of satisfaction began to wash over him. He had convinced himself that the grapes weren't even worth it, that they were sour and unappealing. And with that, the fox walked on, feeling proud of himself for being so wise and indifferent to the grapes he had failed to reach. But deep down, there was a small, quiet voice that whispered in the fox's mind. A voice that reminded him of how delicious the grapes had looked, how he had wanted them so badly just moments before. But he quickly silenced that voice, telling himself that it was better to let it go and move on. And so, the fox continued on his way, his hunger still gnawing at him, but now accompanied by the comforting idea that he didn't need those grapes after all. After all, it was easier to tell himself they weren't worth the trouble than to face the truth, that sometimes things we want are just beyond our reach. As he wandered off into the forest, the fox would never forget the taste of those grapes, but he would never admit to himself that he had failed to get them. Instead, he would tell everyone who asked about his journey that those grapes were simply too sour to bother with. And so, the fox's pride saved him from admitting the truth, but at the cost of his own desires. End. Moral of the story *. It's easy to convince ourselves that something we can't have wasn't worth having in the first place. This story teaches us that pride can sometimes make us deny our true desires, and that we often cope with failure by convincing ourselves that what we wanted wasn't valuable at all.